rocks are different.
And that was lovely to get the shawl from Rosalind, which is Hazel's granddad's.
Amazing,
You know.
amazing. It's fantastic. Right, ladies, I think we'll get started again. We've got these events are always great for networking and chatting. We've got 4 speakers tonight, this afternoon, and we'll start off with Rhoda Hewson, who is currently, but not for much longer, chair of the Unst Heritage Trust. And that's the main capacity that I know Rhoda in, because I'm the museum mentor for their, one of their museum mentors for their museums up there. So we work fairly closely together throughout the year. And Rhoda and Hazel and Anne have been really helpful in explaining Shetland lace to me. I mean, we've pored over garments that are in their collection, and they have explained to me details about them that I would not have been able to see otherwise, and they've trained my eyes in a way to see things, and that's been really useful for this project. So I'm really grateful for them for that expertise and their information and their patience with me. As Rhoda said, when she's no longer the head of the Unst Heritage Trust, she'll have more time for knitting, and we can all relate to that. So, so I'll let Rhoda carry on.
Good afternoon. Now, when you're all settling to your postprandial slump, I have to try and keep you awake. I'm here representing the Unst Heritage Trust, which runs the 2 small museums up in Unst, the Heritage Centre and the Boat Haven. And I'm here today to talk about the Unst knitting, lace knitting, which forms a substantial part of the collection at the Heritage Centre. For anyone who doesn't know where Unst is, I would hope the current audience here would know, but in case anybody doesn't know, it's the most northerly of the islands in Shetland, or as we term ourselves on the island, we're the island above all others. Treasure Island. The Stevensons built the lighthouse, which is the most northerly in Britain. We did some research about that and produced a little book about it, but Robert Louis Stevenson is supposed to have visited, well, he did visit the island and the lighthouse, and it's said that he used the map of Unst for his map of Treasure Island when he wrote the book. Whether that's true or not, I think other places claim the same, but Unst claims that. So we could call it Treasure Island, but certainly it does have treasures. And one of the treasures that we have in Unst is traditions handed on. Since Unst is furthest away from the centre of things, whether you're talking about Shetland or Scotland or Britain, because in a way it's further away from the centre and from influence from out with, it has retained its unique sense of community, and folk on the island still work together to try and retain that unique sense of the island, and also to try and retain viability on the island, because it gets smaller, population gets smaller. In terms of traditions, the Unst Heritage Trust works to retain the traditions that we're proud of. In the past, families would have passed on the skills of spinning and knitting around the peat fire. The younger ones would have learned from the older ones. And last tacked I sock would have been what the older ones would have said to the younger ones. Don't waste time when you could be knitting, which helps the family economy. So they were encouraged to learn to card before they could spin, or to do the outer edge of the shawl, the simplest part, and then learn the more complicated parts as they got older. So that was tradition being passed on. This is now moving forward. Is there another way of moving it on? There we go. Thank you. More recently, during my lifetime, the skills of spinning and knitting have been handed on more formally at evening classes and gathered groups. And these photos show only a few of the people who have taught spinning and lace knitting on the island, including Hazel, who's here today. These two ladies were mentioned earlier on. These are Hazel's grandaunts, and the shawl that Rosalind brought up for us wasn't. These were the two ladies who knitted that shawl. Hazel could tell you more about them if you ask her later. Right, now, this hidden treasure on the island, this small shop, which is now closed, was the scene of an amazing discovery some years ago, a veritable treasure trove of old lace knitting, unfortunately much damaged because it had been lying unattended for a long time. And if I show you some samples of the old fragile knitting that was found in that shop. Very sad, of course, to see it damaged as much, but also a thrill to have this being discovered so that we could then look at it and see it. This letter was found in with the cache of knitwear, and it's dated 1881. It was written by a disabled gentleman who lived in Ewer Sound on the island, and he sounds an interesting fellow. He lived at a time when there was no disability allowance. He would know that nobody owed him anything, as it were. We might have said in the Shetland dialect, nobody's owing me a hen's gutting. Nobody was going to give him anything, nobody owed him anything, so what could he do? Traditional sort of men's work he couldn't do, he was disabled. So, if I get an extract from it up to let you see, he's an invalid and he wants to contribute to the family. So he began to think, what could he do? And he asked the sisters to teach him how to knit. And I wonder how dubious they were at the start of this task. But obviously he said he sat up in bed and learned to knit. Presumably they would spin wool and he would use it to knit. And he obviously persevered with this because Rosalind, in the course of her studies of this fellow, discovered that he went on, in one census he talks about himself as a knitter, 10 years on in the next census he calls himself a lace knitter, and eventually Rosalind found that he won a prize. Was it in a Dundee newspaper? She found a cutting which said he had won first prize in a Scottish competition for his fine lace shawl. So he obviously did learn to knit. Whether any of it was sold, you think, oh, I wonder if they sold anything for him, poor fellow. But anyway, that was where the treasure came from. So the Unst Heritage Centre received this old knitwear for its collection, and many hours of study. I mean, obviously, local knitters were extremely interested, and it was studied in great detail. And we had to make provision for its storage. We had Shetland Museum, and I think some of the people from the Spinners, Knitters and Weavers group, we had help learning how to handle and how to store these precious objects. And then at that point, the Shetland Amenity Trust became involved, and funding was found, and a cabinet was bought that would be able to display this knitwear, and also storage in below the cabinet as well. There's Hazel. She did a lot of the research, and she produced patterns from the old knitwear. Quite a lot of hours involved in that, as you can imagine. And then notices were put up in the local shop saying they wanted knitters to come and do replicas of the old knitwear, because obviously the old knitwear was too fragile to be put on display. So if we had replicas, then that could be shown to the public. So the Shetland Amenity Trust helped with finding funding, and knitters were brought together who would produce these replicas. In fact, up there in the back row are two of the people who did replicas, Hazel and Minnie. You can see them there in the picture. And they each took a different garment, and they would each produce their particular garment replica. So now we have the replicas that we are able to display in the cabinets at the Heritage Centre. I particularly like these little children's socks. I think they're charming. We have visits from, obviously the general public come and visit, but we have particularly visits from spinning and knitting groups during Wool Week in October, which has been a real boost to small museums like ours being able to extend the season. And also on a Friday afternoon at the centre, we do have-a-go sessions where just somebody walking into the centre can have a go at a spinning wheel or have a go with the Shetland knitting belt and try knitting. And that's very popular. So what did we do to, as it were, use this treasure that we got? Well, the Heritage Trust struggles annually to try and make enough money to keep the two small places going, with the work of volunteers being the main background to the trust. So one of the things that we've done is we've produced some books using this vintage Shetland lace, and some patterns and kits. And the main person who's helped to do these things, of course, again, is Hazel, who has the expertise to produce the patterns. So the treasure that we found has also helped us to maintain the centre and enable it to stay open for people to come and visit and see all these things. The Unst Spinners and Knitters continue to keep the traditions alive. And Hazel is one of the main tutors there for people who come in to try to learn. And they also meet with groups. We have Norwegian groups who come over and so on, and our local spinners and knitters can meet with them, and that's much enjoyed by the visitors. This is a fine lace shawl that was knitted recently. In fact, it's sold pre-season, as it were. But that's the kind of authentic fine lace that is still being knitted. But our, I suppose, dilemma for us is that some visitors who come, well, all the visitors who come like to see the displays of the authentic lace garments that we have. And also in the shop, there are still people in our little heritage shop who like to buy the traditional fine lace shawl or stole. But there are also visitors who come in who might want something in a slightly more modern style or garment. So this is where your authentic or real thing comes in. Can the knitter adapt and make, for instance, the cockle shell scarf that's been made for generations is quite broad and not very long. So can they make it narrower and longer to fit the current way that people wear a scarf? I mean, how do you adapt using the lace patterns that are real, authentic Unst patterns or Shetland patterns? And when does it stop being real Shetland? How much can you adapt? So that's the dilemma when we're trying to stock the shop. What should we produce, and what are the definitions of authentic there? So we're very glad to have still some people who produce lace goods for us for the shop. But the future, obviously, is the children. This was a group some years ago who were our peerie knitters from the local school that are being taught to knit. And we were asked to go to the Edinburgh Royal Show in Edinburgh and had a stall there. And you can see some of the little knitters helping others to try and have a go at knitting. It would be good to think that in the future, some of our young people would be interested enough in the traditional lace and knitting that they would carry on the tradition. That's all we can hope for. Thank you.
I think we'll take comments and questions at the end of all the speakers, but I think we now have another definition to add to all of Rosalind's, which is the replica project that you did is now second generation authentic, real Shetland lace. And so it goes. Now, all of the speakers this afternoon are from Shetland, except our next speaker, who is Frances Leonard, and she's works at the Textile Conservation Centre at University of Glasgow. I think I first met Frances when she was working at Winchester, but that unit moved to University of Glasgow, and so now she's colleagues with Lynn and Marina and Rosalind. So I'll let Frances carry on. Oh,
this one here. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, thank you very much. Good. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And I think my talk follows on quite neatly from Rhoda's. As thinking about what to do with damaged examples of knitting or any other type of textiles, and conservation is one of the answers. It could be one of the approaches. And I, as Carol says, I lead the textile conservation programme, which used to be at the University of Southampton and has moved to the University of Glasgow. And it is very exciting to find lots of other little pockets of textile activity going on within the University of Glasgow, not least in the history department with Lynn and Marina. So our programme is a 2-year master's programme, and it is the only programme in the UK where you can study to become a textile conservator. And we take small numbers of students who come from all around the world, and they are learning the skills of textile conservation so that they can look after collections of historic textiles or historically significant textiles. And this is just a picture of one of our workrooms. Our students are really lucky. We work very closely with Glasgow museums and the Hunterian, which is the University of Glasgow's own museum, and lots of other museums around Scotland and wider, further afield. So the students get absolutely fantastic objects to work on. And I'm going to talk today about some of the objects that students have been working on lately. I'm immensely fortunate because we don't actually get very many knitted objects very often to work on. But this semester, it so happens that we've had several knitting projects, so that's very fortunate, and it gives me some nice current examples that I can show you. But before I get to the examples of knitting, conservation, this is probably the thing that people think about if they know anything about what is conservation, what is textile conservation. And it's very much about treating objects and carrying out very intensive treatments to make objects safe to go on display in museums. But conservation is broader than that. It really encompasses these 3 different aspects. So investigation, as really trained observers, we're teaching students to look often at what it is they're working on. And because we often spend months, it can be days and days, it can be months working on the same object, you're often in a really privileged position to look really closely at that object and to contribute to finding out more about it. Preservation encompasses a whole range of different conservation techniques which the students learn, but then we can also contribute to interpretation. So, how do we put textiles on display physically, but also how can we help with interpreting them when they are on display? So I wanted to talk, first of all, just a little bit about this investigation aspect. And thank you to Rosalind for providing this image. This is one of the lace shawls that she encountered whilst she was doing her PhD and belongs to Glasgow Museum's collection. And I don't know very much about it, but I think there was a question arose as to whether the border is part of the original shawl, or perhaps it had been added later. It sort of looks slightly unusual when you look at it in this image. But so I'm just using it as an example, really, to show how we might go about trying to find out more about an object like this, objects that raise questions. And it's partly about understanding the materials that are used. And as textile conservators, we're lucky we often have access to, well, sometimes we have access to equipment which helps us to look much more closely at objects. And I think most textile conservators will have a microscope that they can call on. And on the left-hand side of the screen here, we've just got a rather whizzy new attachment for one of our microscopes, which means that you can see a close-up picture on the computer screen alongside of what it is you're looking at. And here, we're just doing some fibre identification. So if you actually take just one tiny fibre from an object, put it under the microscope, it can often help tell you what the fibre is, whether it's wool or whatever. You need a reference to look at to compare. And we're fortunate we have even more advanced machinery at our centre. So we have things like spectrometry that we can use which really is just identifying what elements are present in organic objects. So that, again, could tell you whether something's made of wool. We use it to look at things like, is it made of nylon, or some of those fibres that are more difficult to identify with microscopes. But you can look really closely at objects. So we could look very closely at the particular fibre, and maybe even look at the type of wool something's made of. I mean, the National Trust, for example, started a programme of looking at their tapestries and they've started to collect samples of wool fibres from tapestries, medieval and later tapestries, to see if they can start to get a sense of what sheep breeds were used to weave those tapestries back in the Low Countries. And, you know, that's the sort of thing that we could look at in much more detail. And even just looking very closely, using even a little bit of magnification can help you to determine whether whether the yarn is hand-spun or machine-spun, for example. So looking closely at the materials can often tell us a lot about the object that we're working on. As well as that, we need to understand the techniques that are used. And one of the courses that the students do is a fairly straightforward textile technology course, because, as I'm sure, I don't need to tell any of you, but you know, there are more textile techniques than I think any other type of material. So from all the woven, non-woven, decorative techniques that are available. And this is one of the student assignments. They have to make a poster, because a poster is a good professional skill. But they have to make a poster about a particular textile technique, and then they create a sample. And again, as I'm sure all of you know, actually making something yourself is the best way to understand it, is to understand its construction. So we encourage that, as Lynn says, in a way, it's sort of practice leading into research. But certainly making mock-ups of things is a very good way of understanding them. And I think I would say, as I mentioned already, perhaps, textile conservators are really trained observers. You know, we're really used to looking closely at objects. But we look differently, I think, from curators. I'm often quite surprised if I'm talking to a curator, you know, somebody who really knows their subject and knows intimately, you know, could date a textile or tell you a lot about where the pattern came from, but they don't look at it in the same way that I look at it, and I would notice much more detail about the condition and what that tells you, both about the construction, how something is made, but also about how it's deteriorated. And that in turn can tell you something about the way that it's used. And we can sometimes pick up patterns of soiling, for example, or creases, which tell you a lot about how an object was worn or how it was used. So that investigation stage can help a lot with trying to come to grips with this question of, you know, what is authentic? Defining authentic is another matter altogether, but we can help to give some clues in that direction. Actually, treating knitted objects is also an area where we can contribute to the whole notion of authenticity, because conservation treatments are very much about stabilising objects. We're not really trying to restore them, we're not trying to put them back to how they looked when they were new. It's very often about just making sure that they're safe for whatever their role is, which might be being put on display, or it might be as part of a handling collection. And it's trying to sort of bring out those stories that, as Carol gave that wonderful example, that museums nowadays collect objects because of their stories, much more than as representative examples of things. And, you know, we can really help with how these objects are presented. This is a rather nice object also from Glasgow Museums, which has been treated recently. Sorry, I don't think the pictures show up very well, but it's a lovely 1930s knitted sort of combination bodice and French knickers, really, I think. And this was in pretty good condition. It wasn't too, it was pretty sound. It was wet cleaned. So that's one treatment that we very often carry out. Cleaning might just be surface cleaning, sometimes wet cleaning, as a way of removing dirt that causes damage in the long term, but also, of course, often to improve the appearance. And it just had this one tiny little hole, which I think you can see where the pins are, and it was in the sort of ribbing at the waist, just on one side of the waist. And the student did look at it and think whether she should do something to it, and she'd try out some experiments. And I think in the end she decided just to put a tiny little patch of net underneath that was pretty much invisible, just secure the knitting so that it couldn't unravel anymore, but that it didn't really need any sort of infill. It was pretty much invisible, really. Another of our current second year students is just embarking upon her dissertation, and she wants to look at the conservation of knitting for her dissertation. So she very kindly provided me with these images, which is great. And she's taken here just a piece of machine knitting, quite coarse machine knitting, and cut holes in it, which is quite difficult for a textile conservator to do to any textile. And she's trying out different techniques for conserving knitting, a knitted structure, and that can be quite tricky. Does this act as a... Yes, it does. So, big holes like this. This shows you the front of the piece, and this is the back, so you can see both front and back together. And this is a very standard technique for conservation. If we're conserving a woven textile, what we often do is put a patch, and you can see the patch here, there, behind the weak area, and use, I don't know if you can see, but there's laid and couch stitching, which anchors that damaged area. The stitching extends into a stronger area to really make sure that you're not putting new stress on that area. And Hannah's tried out various ways of patching. I think she's got, so woven cotton here and here. And this patch, the middle one there, which is this, she's used a jersey cotton, so something with a knit structure rather than a woven structure. And this one, she's used a plain weave cotton, but she's put it on the bias to give more stretch, because of course knitting is much more stretchy than a woven fabric. And she's also tried various sort of Swiss darning techniques here, using different yarns. So she's trying out different techniques for really supporting, stabilising, mending holes in knitted structures. In such, one of her key concerns is maintaining that elasticity that knitting has compared with a woven textile. And Swiss darning is a technique, as you saw, one of the techniques that she was trying out. And this has often been used to mend little holes. This is another student's sort of experiments in Swiss darning. And you're probably familiar with the technique, which really means sort of picking up loops at the bottom of the hole, where you've got hole loops, and then using a needle and thread to replicate the knitted stitch pattern. And that can work really well. And here it's being done in a contrasting colour, but of course you'd use a matching colour if you were doing conservation stitching. And again, it's following the principle of taking the support out into a strong area. This is another knitted object that was treated recently. This is a machine knit, so it's a school scarf from Westminster School in London. We've been working on quite a collection of their school uniforms from their archive. And this is Bevan, one of our students. And again, this was only got small areas of damage. So I think you could perhaps see it there. These are 3 sequential pictures showing how she's going about using a Swiss darning technique to mend little holes in the scarf. And in contrast to the other piece, she decided that this should have some stitching, some conservation to support and to stabilise those holes, because this is part of a handling collection. These objects are used by students at the school, by teachers and researchers. So they do get handled, and she felt it was important that they should have some sort of support so that the holes wouldn't get worse as they were handled. And so she also tried a Swiss darning technique here, which I think has been really successful. She's used a pretty good match of colour, but it's just slightly different. So you could see with close inspection that it's not original, it is a repair. But she sort of investigated various different techniques. This is actually a rib knit, but she decided that trying to do Swiss darning in rib is just completely impossible and makes a really sort of bulky repair. So she just, in fact, treated both sides, the front and the back of the hole, separately, and did 2 separate rows of just knit Swiss darning. She decided against using a patch technique here because a scarf doesn't have a front and a back, really. It's a double-sided item, so she didn't want to put a patch on one side. So these are the 3 stages of putting the Swiss darning in. She's done each row separately with a separate piece of thread rather than working backwards and forwards. And she decided that that would mean that you could remove that infill much more easily than if it sort of went backwards and forwards across the rows of knitting. And this is the final object I was going to talk about, which is a wonderful object, a Sanka glove, which belongs to Dumfries Museum, which is a really fantastic object. And in terms of authenticity, Sanka gloves are really interesting objects. It's really difficult to date, for example, because the pattern is unchanged over such a long period of time, and even today is still made pretty much the same way. I'm sure some of you know about Sanka knitting and know that, for example, they use the same number of stitches. this is the Duke pattern, which is one of the sort of commonly used patterns. But each of the knitted squares always has 11 stitches. And you alter the size just by changing the size of the needles. So it is really difficult to work out how old this glove is. It has the very typical initials on the cuff here, which the student who worked on this decided what spell BH. And she said, again, you can look at very traditional styling of the lettering on these gloves. And she said it couldn't be anything other than a B. It's a bit difficult to see from the glove, but when you look at the traditional patterns, she said it couldn't be anything other than a B. So that's the glove before treatment. This is the glove after treatment. So it looks a lot stronger and a lot more complete. It was in, I'll just go back again, it was in a pretty poor state. It had 2 different types of repair. I don't know, you probably can't see very clearly. Maybe I could show you more clearly in detail. Yes, this is before on the left and after on the right. Yes. And maybe that's self-explanatory. Yes. But there are different sorts of repairs and 2 different sorts of damage, really. There was one type of damage that appeared to have been caused while the glove was in use, and it looked as though it had been mended while it was still being worn by its owner. And that was done in a black thread, and it was a bit crude, but it was, you know, it wasn't too, didn't stand out too much. Whereas there was this other, blue and white stitching, which was really coarse and seemed to have been put in to hold the whole thing together after there had been a lot of insect damage. So later in the glove's career, it had been, the moths had got at it very sadly and had chopped away a lot of it. So Harriet in the end decided to take out this later repair, which was very crude. It was causing a lot of distortion, a lot of damage, and didn't really add a lot to the history. But she left in the earlier repairs. This was in consultation with the museum curator. So she left in the earlier repairs, which, you know, were part of the object's history, really told you something about the way that the glove was worn and worn and worn until it was really starting to deteriorate, but it was mended and it carried on being worn. So that's a very important part of its history. And here she said, you know, she couldn't really reconstruct the pattern because there was too much missing. What she did was to put in a woven wool fabric. Oh, sorry, I keep doing that. A woven wool fabric. I got this. Which fills in a lot of this top part of the finger. And she said she used it on bias to give more of that stretch. And she said, again, that, although this, maybe she didn't at this finger, that doesn't look like the bias, but I know on the palm she used her patch on the bias. And she said herself, you know, to have tried to recreate that whole finger would just have been dishonest, and that was the word that she used. So she was trying to recreate it so you could see what it should have been like originally. It gives you a sense of the overall glove. It makes it displayable. But it was by no means trying to hide the fact that this glove had been damaged in the past. And that's really a sort of one approach to authenticity in conservation that we use. So I think, oh yes, this is just another finger which was also treated in the same way. So there's a lot of work that gone into conserving this glove. She said she tried out both red and black support fabrics to see which worked best, but the black was the one that blended in the best. So, as I say, I just wanted to explain a little bit about how conservation can help to contribute to some study of authenticity, both in helping us to understand more about the past history of our objects, the way that they're made, but also when we think about conservation approaches, you know, that we need to be sensitive to the role of the object nowadays and to its past history. So I just wanted to have a few acknowledgements. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Frances. I think we'll just move on and we'll have questions at the end. And I'd now like to introduce, sorry, get this on. Right, I'd like to introduce Helen Robertson. And she is a local craftsperson who uses very interesting lace stitches in some ways, but other stitches as well in making jewelry. So I'd just like to say that she's actually speaking about a book that was published recently by the local guild, Shetland Guild of Spinners, Weavers and Dyers. And we asked her specifically to come and speak to us today about this book, because this is part of the handing over and the handing on of the tradition. And the value to me of this book is that the knowledge of these traditions that we've been talking about this morning are in these books, in this particular book, that it's developed out of the knowledge that the guild members have. So I'll hand over to Helen.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much. I've really enjoyed the talks today, and I was just sitting thinking I'm wearing my authentic Aran cardigan, but it's made out of Shetland wool, and it was made in Shetland by my mum, who was a Shetlander. So I'm not sure how that fits into the Venn diagram of authenticity. But I'd like to speak today about the making of the Legacy of Shetland Lace book. How do I click this on? Is it just this one? Okay. Before this book was available, when I come back to Shetland in my early 20s, and I got interested in Shetland lace knitting at the time. Now, although I grew up surrounded by knitters, they were very proficient knitters, and it was quite hard to learn, really, because there was very little written down. And what was written down, sometimes it was never charted. It was always just in code that was quite hard to understand and very hard to visualise. Whereas charts, I think, gives you a visual reference when you're trying to create something. There was some patterns in the Shetland Knitter's notebook that was written, and I did struggle on, and I think I made my own charts after them. Sarah Shetland Lace book, sorry, there was patterns in there, but there has been inaccuracies in books that were published previously that we know Ravelry to put the data on, then it could be quite a struggle. I also had access to these two books, Knitting Around the World, Head-a-Piece by Alice Starmore, about Shetland lace, and also Gladys Amidro's book, Hide Patterns, but again they were written in sort of longhand and no very good if you're visual. That's the kind of, we're speaking about, what, 90s, in the 90s, that was all the access that you had to lace patterns, really. And then, and this is what I was saying about the knitters being very proficient. This is the other kind of Shetland lace pattern that you could get if you were lucky. And this is actually my granny's pattern that she wrote, and this is for this garment. So you'd have to have a fair bit of knowledge to get from there to here. I actually used the 6-haul lace in the pattern that I created for the Legacy book. And then this book came along. Now, for me, this was a game changer because it's almost like a Bible to me. It's got everything, or a lot of things in it that I need. And I can remember when it was published, then for kind of groups of knitters of a certain age, it was quite shocking, really. It was kind of shocked by the idea that somebody could come to Shetland, go through the museum collection, chart all the patterns accurately, I must say, and publish a book. But it's such a fantastic book. And the thing is, the question was always, I think we were all waiting for somebody to do it. Somebody in Shetland was going to do this, but nobody ever did. And I have my own ideas of why that might be the case, why it was never done, but I really do think that this was a game changer. It made Shetland less accessible to not only to folk out with Shetland, but to folk like me while we're struggling with things like this. So I'm very grateful to Sharon Miller for the work that she did, and it enabled me to do the projects that I did. This is the upstairs in the restaurant here. You've probably had your dinner, but if you did look up, you might have seen this. And this was also a project that I did, and again, Sharon Miller's book was invaluable. And I wanted to think about why had it never been done before? Why had nobody in Shetland that had easy access to the museum and had easy access in their heads mostly to all this many patterns and all the skills and everything. And I've come to think lately that it was sort of our treasure, that really it's not that long ago that folk were dependent on their knitting, and there are folk still alive that were dependent on their knitting. And to actually give away your patterns, you didn't give away your family patterns, because that was like giving away your family treasure. And also there's a thing in Shetland about not sticking your head above the parapet too. So for that reason, nobody had the guts really to actually, well, nobody that lived in Shetland had the guts to actually write a pattern down and profit for it, because that's what you're speaking about really, is profit. So I think with the Sharon Miller book that changed that, because the kind of secrets were out. Okay, so folk realised that they could, it was free for all. You could actually write the patterns up and folk could sell the patterns. And I was thinking about authenticity in Shetland knitwear, but I think for me the legacy of Shetland Lace book is authenticity in Shetland Lace patterns. So, entered the Shetland Guild. I never can ken if it's spinners, knitters, dyers, weavers, but the order it comes in. But it is a textile group. It's been going since 1988 in Shetland. It meets every month, and really, although it is concerned with spinning and weaving and dyeing, the main interest of the group is knitting, just because of where we're at. The workshops are planned at the AGM, so there's a kind of yearly plan of events, and it's always, the main thing is about sharing knowledge and information. Two of the folk that are in the Guild are, well, a lot of folk that's in the Guild is here today. I kind of think there's not much point in me saying this, because you could all be doing this. But Winnie Balfour and Mary Kay were having a cup of tea one day, and a lot of good ideas come from having a cup of tea. And one of them was this idea of writing down patterns for actual garments. And I think the idea grew, and by the end of the cup of tea it had grown into a book. And although some folks say they're going to write a book, then they actually did it. And they took the idea to the next guild meeting and wondered if anybody would be willing to design or share patterns that they already had. And there's a few folk that came forward and said that they would do it. Now it was a long process. We were thinking probably maybe 4 years for the original cup of tea to the actual book launch, because the knitters that were, it's unlike other books of design patterns that you get that when that folk are full-time designers. The folk that were contributing to this had full-time jobs, apart from designing wasn't their job, and also the designs that they had were mostly like my granny's shawl pattern, hat pattern. So they had to actually decide what they were going to do, write the designs, knit the designs, and make sure everything was working fine. And they tried with the book to get a variety of patterns that was suitable for all abilities. So there's ones that are good for beginner knitters and ones that are still interesting to folk that are more experienced. It was funny because I've been trying to get as much information as I could for Winnie and Mary today. Well, not today, but for a long period of time. But just today, then Winnie was saying that they had a difficulty schedule. We measured in spinning wheels, so it was 1 spinning wheel, 2 spinning wheels. But nobody could agree because everybody thought it was all really easy. So, but this is, I'm just going to have a pretty look at the patterns that were contributed. This is an interesting one because this is Susan Johnson, and it was reverse engineered for a photo that was on the front of a patterns picture. Is Susan here? No. I was amused at Susan because when it came to the launch, then somebody decided we would all wear what we'd made and get our photo time. And Susan said if I knew I was going to wear it, I would never have made it in this yellow. But that's Susan's stall. And she named it Chapelside, that's where Susan stays, it's her address. This is Zena's zigzag scarf. Now some of the patterns in the book, it's not just a book of patterns that somebody's tying another motif and created a garment. They've actually created the actual stitch pattern. And this Zena created when she was 14. She's really interesting. When she was a child at the school, and her teacher kept her back one day, and she was a bit worried about this, but it was so that she could help her with her knitting. Zena could help the teacher with her knitting. And Zena was really keen on the book and really keen on this idea of passing on knowledge and information. And this is Ina Irvin, young Walser. Ina's a brilliant spinner and knitter. I don't know if you've seen on Facebook her latest black shawl. It's incredible. And this was her Shurmill scarf. And this is another example of when she designed the stitch as well as the garment. And Shurmill is the Shetland name for near the sea, and that's kind of describes where Ina stays. And this is Pearl Johnson. Pearl is here today, and she wanted to take a traditional motif but put it into a non-traditional shape. So this was the triangular shawl. And is it a cat's paw? Yeah, good. Phew. And Kathleen Anderson. Kathleen is a brilliant knitter, and she wins prizes regularly at the Highland Show. Very even knitted. I mean, it does look like it's been machine knitted. Maybe his one again machines, I'm not sure. But her knitting is incredible to see. And she designed a scarf, the Raywick scarf, and that's Kathleen stays in Raywick. And this again, there's authenticity, but names of patterns that a lot of the patterns in the book were named after the places where folks stay or where they grew up. And this is Mary Kay's St Ringen's scarf. And again, St Ringen's is just along the road for where Mary stays. And the actual stitch is being designed as well as the garment. And Sue is here somewhere today. Sue in Cochrane is the craft that Sue stays on. And Sue came to Shetland, and did you learn Shetland lace when you were here? Yeah, but very good spinner, and then learnt to knit Shetland lace and designed this pattern. And then Loretta is here somewhere. Again, Shetland designed the pattern and the garment in however many sizes. And this, I put this picture up. Hazel Tyndall, as you probably came to the fastest knitter in the world, she's running a workshop just now for Shetland Wool Week. That's why she's not here just now. But at the launch of the book, then Hazel stood up in front of the crowd, and at that time the Wool Week was pretty enough that it could be in the learning room. I done that you could launch a book at Woolwich in the learning room now. You needs to be like to click them in, or at some kind of outdoor arena. But at the time, Hazel stood up and she said, "Now I'm not a lace knitter," and she'd designed this top in 6 sizes, and something that I was asked to contribute to the book was I was asked to do biographies of the knitters, and I knew just from my experience, because although I've been in the group a long time, but various reasons I've never managed to go as much as I would like to. But I've known over the years that the members of the group are very, very modest. They'll not tell you what they're doing, they'll not tell you what they can do. It's very hard to extract any kind of, it's not pride, but they would never boast about anything that they'd done. And so when I was asked to write the biographies, I knew that I was going to have to trick them into telling me what they had achieved. So what I did was I wrote to them, because I knew if I did a face-to-face interview, I wouldn't get the information. That's the honest truth. I just wouldn't get it. So I got this replies. I started off just kind of, how did you learn to knit? And most of it learned, or when did you learn to knit? Most of it learned when they were about 4, certainly before they went to school. And most of it learned for their family members. Most folk were selling items by the time they were 12 and had continued to knit and sell throughout their lives. But I put in just a straight question. Have you ever knitted for royalty? Yes. I was commissioned by Buckingham Palace to design and knit a Shetland lace shawl for HRH the Queen to present to the Empress of Japan on her visit to the UK. The Queen requested the cockleshell pattern and I incorporated this into the scarf. That was for Zina. I demonstrated knitting to Prince Charles and the late Princess Diana in 1986 and to the Prime Minister of the time. Wow, but remained nameless in the book. Keep her nameless here, that was Pearl. And Ina said, I was commissioned to make fine Shetland lace stoles for the Queen of Norway and Camilla, Duchess of Rothesay, which were presented to them at the opening of the new Shetland Museum and Archives in 2006. I am currently working on another royal commission. And Kathleen said, I was commissioned to make a scarf for the late Queen Mother's 100th birthday. Now, I can't none of that. I'd been going to the group for 20 years, so it was all news to me. Have you ever travelled as a result of your knitting? Kathleen said, yes, I have demonstrated in the National Museum of Scotland. Susan had represented the Guild several times on the mainland, UK. And Hazel Tyndall had been demonstrating on the UK mainland several times and had also taught in Canada and America. And Pearl was the one that I loved the most, because I met Pearl an awful lot, and she would never boast about anything that she'd done. And I did laugh when I got the reply, yes, I have demonstrated knitting in Germany, Norway and Japan. That was great. So this was the display. This is the collected items. The Guild also hosts groups that come visiting, particularly one for Canada, the Joyce James tour group that come for years. And one of the members of that touring group became a benefactor for the Shetland Guild, and that allowed them to fund the photography for the book. So this is a display that was done at maybe a tease or maybe a demonstration group. And this was at the launch of the book. I was thinking today as I was looking through the book, or just during this process, that because the book was designed to be easy, or designed to be accessible, and we have a variety of different patterns, that in some ways it didn't maybe show the skill and ingenuity of the contributors to its full. So I think that there should be another book. and, and that but this time it should be actually like challenging. It should challenge the folk as designers, and it should challenge the folk as knitters. I think that the whole, what the kind of leading members of the working group learned so much about publishing and everything, that it's a shame for that knowledge to go to waste. There is moves afoot for a book possibly on feral knitting and being done very early stages, so anybody can get involved in that wants to. And the group is open. The AGM is next week. It's a very welcoming group, and it's, I mean, there's no very many groups you can be 40 and you're still considered one of the young ones. So really the most important thing is to try and get young folk in and pass that skills on, because the folk are very willing to pass on their skills. So I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Oh, wait.
The bairns would get a glove when it came on. So do get it on.
It's hard to get over. There we go. Thanks. Well, I would endorse what Helen has to say about a volume 2, but I know it's a huge amount of work. So I think it's fantastic that this book has been published, and it not only shows the skill of these particular women, but it's the heritage that they've grown up with is in that book, and it's fantastic. So thanks to Helen for explaining how that came to be. Now, our last speaker is Kathy Cool, who lives on Fair Isle, and she's quite involved in the textile industry, craft in Shetland on several levels. And she produces a line of wool yarn. She has textile holidays and tours, and she teaches textile making, and she is a textile designer herself. So I'll hand over to Kathy. You have a pocket. A pocket. Thank you.
Well, authenticity. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about a subject that fascinates and on many occasions perplexes me. Authenticity seems to be more and more elusive in our day-to-day lives, where the virtual reality becomes ever more pervasive. And I have to admit, in many spheres, the race to keep apace in the digital world leaves less time to consider the significance of authenticity in what we do and in what we consume. Ironically, this means it is more important than ever before in products and experiences to confirm the sense of what is real. Huge effort is put into rendering authenticity into the marketing of things, and sometimes where little exists. I think I lead a highly privileged life. My environment is generally, naturally authentic in so many ways, and I agree, as Charles Guignon argues, ultimately that if we are to rescue the ideal of being authentic, we have to see ourselves as fundamentally social creatures embedded in relationships and communities and that being authentic is not about what is owed to us, but how we depend on others. Now, if I can figure out how to get the next slide. That one. Right. So I've got my list of words here as well. And it's by no means a complete list. So in a digitally extended room full of academics, historians, makers, curators, knitting experts, enthusiasts, authors, and woolly business people, all of these words will have a different level of resonance. Many of them can be expanded on, layered up, added to, and then expressed as a narrative that explains either a professional or personal definition. For the consumer, the majority enjoy finding authenticity. And the important part is that which touches their personal sensibilities. For example, a visitor researching their family history in, let's say, Unst, for no particular reason, could be touched more deeply by the knitted work made by someone from a long family history of knitting and deem it more authentic than a new resident's knitting, regardless of any of the other factors, due to the shared sense of lineage, even more so if these lines converge, which quite often they do. The relationship between the maker and the consumer can be quite specific, but in general terms, one of the strongest consumer emotional needs for authenticity is nostalgia. This is an element tapped into by many of the big fashion brands as they recognise the value of escapism to a constructed memory of past times when things appeared simpler, more grounded and stable, for some at least. Ralph Lauren sponsors the Downton Abbey series in the USA and advertises frequently before, during episodes, and specifically projects an oldie world gentility on many of his knitwear ranges and capitalises on the traditional knitted styles which are reproduced and mass-produced. We have had an industrial revolution, so I'm not knocking mass production, but it is quite a different product. None of it would have evolved without the traditional skills existing first. Continuing the practice of traditional skills, such as spinning and knitting, has many benefits for head, hand, and heart. This is Upper Low in Fair Isle, one of 18 crofts on the Isle. There is no shortage of fleece, or spinning wheels, or variety of wool products. There's lots of help at hand and a small but steady number of visitors to take part in workshops. Sometimes we're just a bit short on product quantity. Throughout the Isle, people still hand knit, and some knit a variety of hand-framed items for sale online and to cruise ship visitors. The museum on the island is a treasure trove of authenticity. I would defy anyone not to find their own definition there. Where the rest of the world has seen a huge and wondrous revival of knitting skills, Fair Isle has just kept on knitting. However, since there is more fleece than hours in the day to hand spin it all, and much would be industrially spun in any case, I decided to have selected Fair Isle homegrown Shetland fleeces, custom mill spun. Sorting and sending it south has become an annual event over the past 7 years. And you can see some of the sorting happening down in the corner there, with lots of helpers and lots of different colours of Shetland fleece. So now there are 5 shades of natural coloured 3-ply light Arn weight yarn, and 6 shades of 2-ply worsted weight. The yarn is used for both knitting and weaving. But I don't have a picture of the 2-ply worsted weight because I just haven't got round to that yet. So workshops are happening in hand spinning, knitting, weaving, felting, lots of different traditional textile skills. But what happens when you take the traditional skills away from home? So this was my idea to do a few things. See what happened. Would people be interested to come to workshops I was organising somewhere other than Fair Isle? Could I do it in the middle of winter and try and extend a bit of tourism into the winter season? Would I enjoy it? So it wasn't that I was trying to do anything difficult, you understand. The skills didn't change, except lace knitting was more to the fore, as you would expect in Unst, because I take it that is legible, what's written up there. You don't need me to read it to you. The participants were awestruck by the Heritage Centre, the lace collection, the fine spinning, and the friendly welcome of the knitters. An authentic textile tourism epiphany in the middle of winter. And here's some of the very happy participants. I think they're very pleased with what they've done. The hands-on experience of creating their own unique designs and textiles in an authentically restored setting, albeit a very luxurious one, which maybe wasn't as authentic an experience after all, but it was very much enjoyed and a very satisfying experience for them. The sense of place had many layers of authenticity, as did the handling of materials from raw fleece through to finished textile items. There's not a lot of knitting there at that point in time anyway, but we did get round to some. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger theorized that understanding is the care that comes from handling. The understanding becomes highly personal, and authenticity becomes both an external and internally conscious experience. The items made were unique to each person, the time and the place. Now, here's a little sample of, looks quite chunky up on a big screen, but it's quite fine. Hand-spun worsted technique made from prepared tops. It was spun in Shetland, spun on a Shetland spinney. It was wheel number 100, made in Fair Isle by Stuart Thompson Sr., a man of Unst lineage. So it's well supported by tradition, and I think that helps it be authentic, or be perceived to be authentic. But what of these ones? It's still the same traditional hand skill, a few different techniques involved, but still spun on a spinning wheel. And it's original, and the designs are original. You won't be able to buy any of those yarns in a shop, and they're contemporary. But are they less or more authentic? I'm only asking the question. I don't have the answer. don't know, it would be interesting to do a survey and just ask everyone what is your perceived level of authenticity for these? But we've maybe not got time to do that. And these knitted cushions. They've got my label on from the Fair Isle Textile Workshop. They are attempting to be very contemporary. But what level of authenticity are they perceived to have? The original source of inspiration is natural and it's place-specific. All the lichens that I drew inspiration from were on surfaces throughout Fair Isle. The knit technique is not traditional, knitted on the fine gauge Shima machine at the Textile Facilitation Unit at Shetland College. They could be, but will not be mass produced by the thousand. And yet, these could be protected by design copyright because they're sufficiently different and innovative for that to be possible. Whereas traditional knitting is very difficult because the techniques and the patterns have long been in the public domain. Even the label and the text inside could be copyrighted. I always want to say copywritten, but that's not right. Excuse me. So I hope you do like them. So here's some more contemporary, original designs, place-specific, inspired by the industrial Shetland landscape. But do they have any inherent authenticity? Would a traditional garment from a bygone era, faithfully reproduced today, hold more? Like I say, I ask the questions. I don't have the answers. Joanne Turney, in her book, The Culture of Knitting, provides a point of view questioning the resurrection of knitting as a sign of authenticity in an increasingly inauthentic world through three factors working simultaneously. 1, the meaning of craft. 2, the desire for difference. And 3, a fondness for nostalgia. These sentiments might suggest that knitting is merely a retrogressive move to create stability in contemporary society. The evidence, however, suggests the contrary. Knitting embraces the new, particularly in fashion, and although motifs and patterns are presented as having a linear and unchanging history, they frequently change to suit the dynamics of style trends. It would also seem evident that knitting also cross-fertilizes into other crafts equally dynamically. Frances Wilson's porcelain bowls reflect place, knitting and the sea, and the use of the fabric of Shetland lace and knitted patterns such as old shell, print of the wave and cockle shell. It's an authentic process. It's a new process, it's been developed and it's unique, and each piece is handcrafted. So the level of authenticity can only be very high. However, the designer Jean Muir certainly drew inspiration from Fair Isle knitting and applied it to ceramics for the Minton factory. But the production method, to me anyway, suggests a loss of authenticity. Not that I don't think they're very nice designs, I do, and I'm very fond of them, but there's just something lost in going from well, I can see where the inspirations come from, but the hand-knitted Fair Isle Kep underneath the mass-produced ceramic dish holds more authenticity for me, personally, than a ceramic representation of it that's factory-produced. Maxine Bristow, in her essay, Continuity of Touch, Textiles as a Silent Witness, brings another layer of authenticity into focus. She highlights the effect of wear on fabric as the evidence of all the living contact it has witnessed, an intangible history, a memory held by what is missing or of what is left embedded in the cloth. Hand knitting, as it progresses, also witnesses all that occurs during its making. It might also reflect the effects of events on the maker through a dropped stitch, a mistake, or a slight change in tension. Knitting can also influence those who witness the process and the events surrounding it. These verses from a poem by the late Lisa Sinclair, I knew this was going to crack me up, so sadly missed by all of us in Fair Isle, convey so much in a few lines. Every day, every spare minute, between the tatties peeled and boiled, between the table set and the men hand-washed and ready, the woman sits working steady alchemy. Time turns to money, fields of wool into cloth, strands of life and colour, thought and moment, knitted quick as the clock's sure tick towards dinner time. So I just think it just sums up that witnessing of a process of knitting so aptly. And it's daily life, artistry and income all in one. It's a business. How can we protect it? This is some more contemporary designs. Could take out a design copyright on them, I expect, but won't. One thing, it costs money. It doesn't offer you an awful lot of protection. You'd have to know that somebody was copying you before you could actually act on it. And I don't actually know that you would be compensated in any great way, even if you proved your point. So it's not always affordable, but you can protect yourself from the other side of the coin a bit. Because what worries me is that I might accidentally come up with something that's quite similar to somebody else's, and it's just chance. It's just because we've maybe looked at similar sources of, or maybe not even similar sources of inspiration. It's just the materials available, the techniques might all just converge into something that is similar. And you could get into trouble with that, especially if it was some big company with quite a lot of money. They could take you to court over it. So the way I avoid that is a digital version of the poor man's copyright. It won't win the war against plagiarism, but it might help in a battle. So this is all the research work and source materials that went into that collection. So I used digitally dated image files of sources of inspiration, research, samples, processes and finished pieces. And that can at least demonstrate the timing and the validity of your own work. I worry that I might inadvertently just come up with something similar to somebody else's. So I keep sketchbook records, I photograph everything, and keep dated copies stored electronically. You can email the images to a friend and then get them sent back to you to render them tamper-proof. The old-fashioned way of doing it was to put your design work and your samples in an envelope and post it to yourself and keep that unopened. But ultimately that can be tampered with, so it's not quite as secure. So here's a bit of business advice from Pine and Gilmore, or Gilmore and Pine, from their book, Authenticity, What Consumers Really Want. People no longer accept fake offerings from slickly marketed phonies. They want real offerings from genuinely transparent sources. And there are two standards of authenticity, they say. I think we've come up with more, but one, whether an offering is what it says it is, and two, whether it is true to itself. So I think it's basically, you have to do what you say on the tin. You know, if your process is a handmade process and you say that, that's what it has to be. So how do we bring all this together in Shetland? The traditional, the contemporary, the makers, the consumers, the workshops, the heritage, the education, and the industry. Will Week. And here's where I've cheated a bit. This was for a different presentation. Put it in here. But here we are. Textiles, tourism and beyond, because Shetland wool can touch everyone, be it in the heartwarming sight of sweet little lambs springing around in the Shetland landscape, the warmth of traditional garments crafted with awe-inspiring skill, the history, heritage and spirit of both man and beast. Or the innovations, inspiration, contemporary design, environmental and social relevance of the continuing story in its time and place. Shetland Wool Week celebrates all of this and more. It's growing naturally, just like the fleece itself, with something for everyone. Thank you. I think we've still got all the words. And if you've any questions, I'll try and answer them.
Thanks very much, Kathy. Oh, yeah, I'll take that. Thanks. Thank you very much. Rosalind's just reminded me that we have in our schedule that right now we're having coffee and cake, and then we're coming back for discussion. I know that we've ordered special cakes in a way, so I think we shouldn't let them dry out. But as long as you promise to come back, because that's our worry, is that you'll... So we're back here at...
Supposed to be 3:15, but we can see.
We'll be back here at 3:30. We'll reconvene here at 3:30 for a wrap-up discussion. Thank you.